Their radio.
Radio. Their radio.
Daniela Garcia Hamilton is a painter and art educator who creates art that brings forth questions about tradition. At the time of this recording, Daniela was preparing to show her solo project, Coyote, at Expo Chicago. We spoke with her about her goal as an art educator, questioning these traditions, the meaning of Coyote, and including embroidery in her most recent artwork. You can find her work at www.dannygarciaart.com or follow her on Instagram at DHNNIII. All of this will also be included in this episode's description. Thank you, Daniela, for stopping by and sharing with us your experiences, your memories, and the music in this episode. We hope y'all enjoy it.
So I'm Daniela Garcia Hamilton. I'm a painter, but I'm also an art educator, and I teach high school art over at Westlake High School. I graduated from Cal State Long Beach back in 2018 with a bachelor's in fine arts in drawing and painting, and I'm currently an MFA candidate at Cal Arts.
One of the first ways that I first found out about you was through social medias and really through connecting with different accounts, and I think one of the main ones was the Southgate Museum account and what they do. So that's how I really got connected into the work you're doing. I really enjoy that it's very vibrant and there's also a lot of color, but there's a lot of also I see a lot of memories that are connected to the paintings. But I did want to ask you, starting off first, like, what is one of the earliest memories that you have with art and with creating art?
I think the earliest memory I have with making art was when I was maybe like around 4 or 5. My dad used to do a lot of home improvement stuff around the house, and he was kind of the kind of person that taught himself how to do everything. And I remember that we had like an old fireplace that was like really outdated, and he wanted it to look nicer, so he ended up making like a sketch or a diagram of how he wanted it to look. And I remember walking over to him and watching him do it, and then seeing what the fireplace looked like afterwards, that it made me want to do the same thing. Like, I wanted to make those little scribbles become reality, and that's how I started just drawing as a kid, and then it just kept going from there.
Did you ever have any type of like formal like art classes as a kid, or is that something you picked up on your own?
No, I didn't get any formal training until I went to college as a transfer student in Long Beach, actually. Like, the only thing I had was like high school had like art classes, but I remember the teachers I had weren't very good. They were like older on their way out, so they weren't really teaching skills. They was just kind of like basic projects where they'd be like, okay, we'll do this thing, but they never explained how to do it. So I did a lot of the stuff just kind of by practice. Like, I practiced. I was always drawing like similar things over and over again until I could get better at it. And it wasn't until I got to college that I learned some actual technical skills that I could apply to my work, and that ended up being what launched it farther after I got my undergrad.
I did want to ask you, just because you mentioned practicing over and over, was there anything in specific that you would draw or you would like to draw?
Yeah. So I had this portrait of one of my, it was a picture, a school picture of one of my cousins from Mexico. And it was like a picture that my aunt had gifted me of him. And I remember from the time I was 12, that was like my marker. Every year, once a year, I would redraw that photograph, and I would keep all of the drawings throughout the years just to see if I had improved at all. And it was pretty cool to see just how the way I looked at it and like took in the information shifted as I got older and as I practiced more, and I started creating more realistic drawings after I did that. But it was a lot of portraiture that I started off with.
Is there a reason why you were really focused into that specific portrait?
I think the reason for it was because my family always knew that I could draw, but the way a lot of Latinos are is if you don't do it super realistically, they're like, "Oh, well, you didn't do it right," kind of thing, no matter what age you are. So I remember the first time my aunt asked me to draw that picture, I I guess I didn't do it right because she like commented on a lot of stuff. So that always kind of stuck with me. And I kept redrawing that photo until I could get it to a point where I felt like if I showed it to her again, even though I never really did, I never showed her the redraws of it, that she would finally be like, oh, that looks just like the picture.
It's awesome. And I know a lot of your focus as well now is portrait and just like having people involved with your painting. I also read that you had originally, you had been on track to pursue a nursing career, right? But then there was a shift with that. So I did want to ask you, what was that moment that gave you the confidence, to fully pursue art?
It was when I was actually because I was a transfer student, so I went to like my local community college out in Lancaster, and originally for the first 2 years or year and a half, I was going towards the nursing degree, just because as a first generation kid, the number one thing they hammer into you is that if you're going to go to school, it should be for something that's like a STEM degree, basically, because that'll make you money. And it's like anything else doesn't really lead towards that, so there's no point in pursuing it. And I remember the day that I decided to switch out. I had been like secretly taking some of the art electives, and I hadn't told my parents. And it was like the fourth time I had ditched my microbiology class, and I was like on my way to like Santa Barbara to like check out like something that was like art related, and then like in the car ride there I was like, I don't want to do nursing. And I remember when I drove back, I went straight into like the admissions office and I told them that I wanted to switch over to like the studio arts degree. And after I had done it, like I told my mom like right away that I had switched it, and she was always very supportive and trying to get me to do whatever I wanted. So she was fine with it. But I remember I didn't tell my dad for like 2 weeks because I knew he was gonna be mad. And when I did tell him, like he gave me like the strong silent treatment where he didn't talk to me for a couple weeks. And then finally he came back to me and he's like, okay, well, if you're going to do that, are you going to do teaching or anything else? And I was like, yeah, I can do teaching. Like, I'll do that. But that's how I ended up getting out of it. And I transferred straight into Long Beach for their BFA program like a year and a half later.
And now you do teaching currently at the
I
moment.
do. Yeah. Now I teach us. That's my day job. Like I teach high school kids. And I mean, I love it. I love working with the kids. And like the best part about being, I think, an art teacher is there's no curriculum that's set forward. So I get to teach them whatever I want in whatever order I want. And there's no one really telling me that that I have to do it a certain way. So I love that freedom because I get to teach them like a ton of projects that are tailored towards like Latino heritage or just like the demographics of the school. So it makes it so much more fun to like infuse the skills that I feel like I never got when I was in high school with projects that are more interesting for the kids.
Is As a teacher, is there a goal for you that you would like for your students to know or take away from your class?
Yeah, the number one thing I tell them at the beginning is like the best student that I have at the end of each year is not the kid who comes in the most talented, but the one who improves the most by the end. And I always tell them, I'm like, and 90% of the time, my most improved kid is never a talented kid that's perceived as talented. It's just a determined kid. It's a kid who comes in who has a spark for it. They don't know where to start. They've never done it before, but they have such an interest in it that they take in every lesson I tell them. And that's what makes them great. Because my kid who comes in talented is usually closed off to learning something new because they've already been told that they've gone to the skill that they should be at. So they don't see a reason to grow. So growth is the biggest thing that I push towards my kids at the end of the year.
And I think that's amazing as well, just because I think in any type of subject, in any type of um, environment that we're in, growth is important. But I did want to ask you one thing, just because as I was also doing my research, I
Mm-hmm.
went into your website, and the first thing that it shows is your piece, Hasta aquí llegamos. And I wanted to ask you, why was it important for you to have that piece as the introduction in the front of your website?
That's a because so most of that piece is so important. Mainly because all of my work is about immigrant culture, but it's specifically about my experience and how my experience and my upbringing is all stemmed back to the moment where both of my parents chose to leave Mexico and come to the U.S. It's like everything that we have, everything that my kids will have, that my grandkids will have, it's all going to be stemmed back to that one moment where they chose to make that journey and like created like this huge shift in what our lives could have been. So that portrait is actually a portrait of my dad, and it's a painting of him sitting on like my sister's couch holding like his firstborn nephew, or no, his firstborn grandson, I'm sorry, my nephew. And he's just kind of looking back, reflecting, thinking about, because my dad, whenever he talks about the journey, he doesn't really talk about the beginning or the struggles of it. He talks about the end result, and like he loves like where he is now, and like just the promise of like the future. But me, I always think about the beginning of it. So in the windows in the back, it tells like my dad's like story of like when he was like a kid. He was like taking care of goats from the time he was like 5 up until he was like 7. And then from there, he moved on to working in like my uncle's fields, like growing the corn. And that's when he ended up deciding to leave, and he moved on to like California in the Antelope Valley. So like if you look at the bottom of the painting, there's like a small child that's looking back at a dog, and the dogs always symbolize coyotes, or the beginning of the journey that brings people over. So me as a kid and like as an adult, I'm always fascinated with that beginning portion, versus showing like my dad is more so happy with the end result, and he's always dreaming about what's next. So that's what that piece really signifies. It signifies that like everything that has come and is going to come is all because of that initial starting point.
And that kind of also leads up to this next question, which is the upcoming solo exhibition you have. Congratulations on that.
Thank
It's
you.
titled Coyote, right?
It is, yeah.
And it's gonna be at the Chicago Expo. But I wanted to ask you, is that the origin of that name? Is that connected to it?
It is. The series that I did with my first solo show with Luna Anais Gallery, I started kind of tapping a little bit into the symbolism of like the coyotes, and how I started realizing that my perception of them was very distinct from other people that I had talked to. Like most people view coyotes as very negative, just because most of the time they're not like great people. I mean, they're charging to smuggle people over, but it's the act of the job itself is something that always felt very sacred to me. And that's where the new exhibition kind of comes in, where I'm starting to delve into the coyotes being like the silent guards, or like the ones that are just kind of watching over and seeing the way that all these different stories are unraveling based off of that first like initial step in the beginning.
Where did this motivation or this want to know more about the past come from for you?
I think it comes from like as a kid or even as an adult, like there's just traditions, there's things that I've grown up with that have never been questioned. Like one of the ones that I looked into a lot was like celebrations, like birthday celebrations in particular, like how we have like things that always happen. Like a kid always gets pushed into the cake, there's always a piñata, like there's always all of these small acts of almost like sometimes violence, but also like a mix of emotion of joy and like happiness and like sharing the moment. And I always wanted to know, well, why do we do this? And no one seems to have like an answer for it. Like I've asked before, like, why is it that we push the kid's head into the cake? And everyone's like, well, that's what we've always done. And it's like, well, why? Like, where does it come from? And that's where just like that desire to find out, well, where does all of this root from, that we've all just accepted it and we've continued to pass it on without questioning why we do the things that we do. And I think that's where that desire to really dig into like our past, like whether it's the physical past of like the stories that like my parents have lived, or like my own childhood past, or just like seeing like the reason why I took certain steps to get to where I am now. Like all of this kind of adds up into what ends up being the traditions and the celebrations that we pass on to the next generation. But being more conscious of it is what I'm trying to achieve.
When you mention right now the next generation, I also see that a lot of the perspectives that you bring into your paintings are children, you know?
Yeah.
So I did want to ask you, is that what is the inspiration behind bringing that perspective, the children's perspective?
I think the reason for that is because I have my strongest memories are from my own childhood, that like all of these things kind of stem from. But it's also just seeing like all the children in my paintings are my relatives. So they're all like either the youngest generation of my cousins that I watched grow up, that I took care of, and then now my nieces and nephews that are like babies and they're starting to go through it, and just kind of watching as they navigate the same celebrations and activities that I went through as a kid, and watching how their parents that are the same generation as me continue to pass it on, and seeing the way that they tweak it a little bit depending on like their experience that they've had here in the US. Like that's something that really fascinates me. And it's the way that these kids start to interact and like shift through these celebrations that's going to end up determining the way that they're going to choose to pass it on. And it's like all of these decisions and choices are so like I've realized that they're not conscious decisions. Like my family just does them. Everybody just does them. Like nobody sits there and questions like what like why would I get a piñata for my kid's birthday party even if they're a third generation Latino? Like it's just kind of ingrained. So like seeing the way that like the kids kind of navigate through it and then the adults kind of impose it, it's just something that's really fascinating to me.
For yourself, have you been able to find what that root is?
Not yet. And that's fine with me. I mean, the more I'm kind of digging for it, the more work that kind of comes out in the different directions that it starts to stem into. Like I said, it started before where it was very like at the very beginning, at the end of my undergrad, it was very direct. It was like immigration policies. And then I got more personal with it and I started diving into certain types of celebrations like bautismos, and then I got into like birthday parties, and then now I've started to shift more into kind of like day to day instances. So it just kind of every time I think I answer a question, it takes me into like another area that I can explore.
And that kind of got me thinking as well as the way we communicate. At least for myself as well, I'm thinking about the way I communicate with others. I have a friend who I always like jokingly around like communicate, and sometimes it can be a little too far, but then at the same time I'm like, damn, like, but that's kind of like the way we know, and in a way culturally like communicate as well. Where like, oh, like where I'm coming from and I know where you're coming from,
Yeah,
but that isn't acceptable and that isn't a good thing everywhere. You know what I mean?
it's kind of like code switching. So it's like determining the way in which you can speak with someone and the lingo that you use is like determined on the amount of comfortableness that you feel around them. So it's like with all of my deals, like I wouldn't talk to them the way I talk to my cousins, even though I am equally comfortable around them. But it's like I know that for them, like they prefer to have a more formal relationship versus like with my cousins, we can mess around a little more. And then again, it switches because then with my youngest cousins, I don't do that, even though they're like younger than me. It's like it switches back into like that formal relationship because like you're like now the authority figure around them.
And then speaking of celebrations, I did also want to talk about a recognition you recently received from the Lakers organization.
Oh yeah.
For the Lakers in the paint program. And I had also interviewed Kiara a few months ago. And I know they also got recognition for that, and they brought someone special to their recognition. So I wanted to ask you if there's someone that specifically that you took there to the recognition. Um, did
I
you?
did. So I took my dad. My dad has been a huge fan of the Lakers since he like first came here like in the 80s. And honestly, the whole reason I applied to the show is because I knew that the team was going to be there. And I was like, oh, if I get in, my dad would get to meet one of the Lakers players. And like I got in, and when I took him, he had a blast. Like it was a crazy event. Like they took us over like in a Lexus to like the show. And my dad had never been in like a car like that, so he was like super excited. And then when we got there, there was just like Lakers players and like old players from like the 80s. There was like a lot of people that everywhere he looked, like he recognized someone, and he had so much fun getting to kind of go around and see like all the people. And then we got introduced to a couple of them just because I was one of the artists, so he loved seeing that too because he got to take pictures with them.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I'm glad to hear that. Especially because the Lakers also play like a huge role in LA culture, so that's awesome
Yeah.
that your dad was able to be a part of that. I have a few more questions that I have left. I did also want to ask about a recent piece that you were doing, which was embroidery. You started doing embroidery, and you said that was a technique that your grandma taught you. So I wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit more about the process and the inspiration behind using a string.
Yeah. So my the portrait itself is actually a portrait of my grandpa, and I was really close to my grandpa before he had passed away. Like he was the reason I think I got into art. Like he wasn't an artist himself, but he was the most fantastic storyteller you would ever meet. Like the stories that he would kind of make up to us as kids, or even the ones that he would tell us as adults. Like I always had to sit there and be like, "Is this true, abuelito, or are you making this up?" Because he's he was so good at like weaving these fantastical narratives that it kind of inspired me to create the narratives I do now, just like in paint. And when he passed away a year ago, it was like a big hole that he kind of left behind because he was a huge part of like my mom's side of the family. And when he passed, I started spending more time with my grandma, and I realized that I didn't know anything about her. because I had spent so much time with my grandpa and I really did interact with him more that I didn't even know like what my grandma had done for a living like her whole life, like anything really about her that much. Like I just knew general things. And it's in the time that I spent with her that she shared that she was actually she spent most of her life working in textiles. And she did things from like sewing to fixing shoes to cleaning clothes, and then to also just selling like hand embroidered tablecloths and things like that. And when she told me about that, she was like, I could show you how to do it. Like, it's not hard. And like in the time that I spent with her, she showed me how to do like some of the cross stitching and other things like that. And it was after I learned how to do that technique that I felt very close to her. But at the same time, I also felt like I was getting closer to my grandpa. And that's kind of what inspired me wanting to try to make a portrait of him using that same technique that she had taught me. So it was like a moment where I could connect to both of them at once, like the storytelling, like with the techniques that she had done her whole life.
It's also builds into what you have done, because I think more than anything your work also kind of connects different generations,
Yeah.
and different generation, and I think that's hella important, especially when thinking about the future and thinking about what's coming up and how it's all connected. So I definitely do appreciate that, and I think it's amazing, and it's so awesome how you're doing it, and it looks like 3D and it's string. I'm like, that's wild.
Thank you. That was actually like the first one I did, and my grandma, she didn't like it because she said I didn't do it right. She taught me how to do cross stitch, and if you've ever seen cross stitch, it's very neat. Like it's you're trying to do the most with the least amount of string, and you're not supposed to see anything in the back. And if you turned mine around, it looked like a freaking rat's nest because I was just pulling the string all over the place. Because it was more like I was drawing or painting with the string, and I wasn't really doing the exact technique that she taught me. So I remember when I showed it to her, she's like, "That's great, but you did it wrong." And I was like, "I know, I'm sorry, Abuelita."
That's funny. That kind of reminds me of what you had mentioned earlier about your tia, and like it was like, do it again.
Yeah, it's like, do it again.
But I do want to ask you, what does your family think overall of your art now and the way that it's been, showed in these different places?
They're very proud now. They're very shocked. They never they never kind of realized, I guess, how big the art world kind of stretched. And I mean, to be fair, I didn't either. Like when I was in high school, I the only thing they ever taught us about art was like Renaissance or old white men in the Impressionists. So it's like I honestly thought painting and all this stuff was dead. Like I thought it was a thing of the past and it was things that people did on Sundays, but I didn't know that it was a whole world out there. Like an art market, like there's like teaching, there's like so many different branches and so many different circles of the art world that you can get into that it's like crazy to see. So every time I get into anything, or like even with the Chicago Expo, like my parents are coming with me, and I keep trying to like explain to them what it's going to be, and they just can't seem to quite comprehend that it's a giant warehouse with like over 400 galleries that just for 3 days, and it's just for selling. And they're just like, what do you mean? Like, who comes and spends this much money? And I was like, collectors. Like, this is like a whole thing. So they're like excited to see, like they're learning all this stuff kind of as I learn it, but they love to kind of see all of the images of like our family like all over the place. And like anytime they share it, like when I got into the Lakers thing, like they were posting like pictures of like my painting of like my cousin or things like that, and they're like, look, like it's your cousin on the Lakers website. So they love seeing like all their images being shared all over the place.
This is the last question I have for you. I mean, your art has traveled, and I'm glad that you've been able to also bring your family with you. Is there a location that you hope to one day see your art?
Yes. I really want to see it in Guanajuato. That's where my dad's from.
Is there somewhere in specific in Guanajuato that you would like to see it, or just any?
Anywhere in Guanajuato. Like if I could have it in like the capital city, like that would be like my dream come true, just because I still have a lot of family that lives in Guanajuato, and they've never had the chance to see any of my real work. Like the things that I've been doing, they've only ever seen pictures. So, and like I've seen when my family here, when they do come to a show and they see it in person, like they're shocked because they don't expect like this tiny little picture to be what it actually is, like a massive painting that doesn't translate well in a photograph. And I love seeing like the look of like orgullo, like when they see themselves in like these images. So to be able to show in a place that's accessible to my grandpa and like my grandma in Mexico, that would be amazing.
That's awesome. And I think that's also the main reason that you got into art, right? You mentioned
Yeah,
like the origin and interrogating what the origin is. So I hope that it does. I hope one day you'll see your art there.
that'd be amazing.